And that, kids, is how you become a great horror writer. Do a lot of acid and then have a really, really bad trip. Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back to the Library of the Weird. I'm super excited today because I'm going to review the book that made me do a YouTube channel. I've been wanting to make one for a long, long time, but this is the book that made me decide what niche I want to do my content in, and that is Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe by Thomas Ligotti. It's a short story collection containing about 30 short stories on 450 pages. It also features a foreword by Jeff Vandermeer, who is pretty famous in the weird fiction community. And it also features this beautiful, beautiful cover made by Chris Mars, whom you definitely should follow on Instagram. This short story collection is basically a collection of two short story collections. The first being Songs of a Dead Dreamer, which was originally released in 1985. And the second part of this book is Grimscribe, which was first released as Grimscribe: His Lives and Works in 1991. And those two books are actually the first two short story collections released of Thomas Ligotti. He has released a lot of stories, a lot of books since then, some of them even non-fiction. He hasn't been releasing much in the last years. He's become kind of a bit of a recluse, I'd say. He's also a very, very let's say peculiar person. He doesn't really do interviews or talk to reporters. There are a few out there that you can look up, but most of the info on him and on his work derives from people working closely with him. And that was not always the case. I've read that he was a very, very extroverted and outgoing person in his youth, but I believe when he was 19, he had a really, really bad acid trip, and after that he started to write stories, and it really, I think he says that it really changed his character. And this is basically why you shouldn't do drugs, I guess. But in this case, I mean, I don't know if it really panned out for him, but it panned out greatly for us because we get to read his fiction, which is phenomenal. He also became a very, very nihilistic person. He's written a book which is called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, on his worldview. It's a book containing a few of his essays, and he's talking about why he's a nihilist, and he also calls himself, I think it's called anti-natalism, which basically means that you don't think people should procreate because the world is bad, or I don't know, because of very different reasons. I think he's a very, very interesting person. He's also worked together with an experimental band called Current 93, and written, I believe he's actually written songs for them, and he has done a lot of work for the genre. And since he's such a private person, I think the stories really, really speak for themselves, because he doesn't talk much about them, but a lot of other people do. He was once called the best kept secret in contemporary horror fiction by the Washington Post, which probably was once the case, but definitely is not the case anymore, because at least in weird fiction or weird horror, he's a very, very famous person, like in the tradition of H.P. Lovecraft. And speaking of Lovecraft, while Ligotti doesn't really write about things like the Great Old Ones or Cthulhu or other gods or of the mythos, he writes in a very, very Lovecraftian way. I mean, at least for me, as a not native English speaker, he uses very, very what's the word for it? Let's say difficult words, long words that you don't read a lot. And he's also, I mean, that basically stems from him writing mostly in the weird fiction genre. He's also not a fan of explicit horror. In the sense of he's not writing about debauchery. You don't see much gore or blood, or you don't even see sexual assault or stuff like that. He achieves a very, very dark and sinister atmosphere with his writing, and that's basically the horror of it. While you're reading his stories, you're growing more and more horrified. And at the end of many of his stories, I just sat there and said, what the fuck did I just read? Because there's oftentimes a twist that you sometimes do expect, sometimes you don't really expect. And that makes reading his stories really, really great. And he's not, if you want to compare him again to Lovecraft, Lovecraft always, or most of the time, his stories are set somewhere around the place where he lived in Massachusetts, or somewhere around the east coast of the US. And always in the time Lovecraft lived in. Lovecraft often uses these reports, like he's talking through letters or something like that, of people who actually lived through the things happening in his stories. And and Thomas Ligotti does not, in many of his stories, you don't actually know, okay, which time period is this, where is the story set. He often writes in a very, very gothic sense, but he rarely uses actually the gothic time. I mean, there are a few stories in here which are obviously set in a gothic or gothic-esque time, but for many of the stories, they could be set in the 1920s. They could also be set in the 1990s, where he wrote many of the stories. And I really, really do like that oftentimes you're quite unsure where the story is set. But let's talk a bit about this book here. Like I said, there are about 30 short stories in here. I think the first part, so Songs of a Dead Dreamer, is a bit longer than the second part, but let's see. So the first part is 200 and 230. Okay, they're almost equal in length. The first one is 235 pages, and the second part is about 200, a bit more than 200 pages long. And I think the stories in here all feel very, very unique. I'm going to talk about the stories in a bit, but their stories, like I said, set in the Gothic times. There's stories set. There's stories which are pretty obviously set in the late 20th century. Then there are stories about vampires, about wizards. So he actually delves into the fantasy genre as well. But then there's very, very realistic stories about serial killers or about death cults. And what he does, especially with the fantasy ones, is that he tries to subvert the traditional tropes that are out there in fantasy fiction. And this also makes the stories very, very interesting. Let's just talk about a few of the stories for a second. The first story I want to talk about is actually the first story in this collection, and it's called The Frolic, which was actually made into a movie, or is part of a movie. It's a rather short story. It's 16 pages long, and it's one of the most realistic stories. At the beginning of the story, we're following this psychiatrist who's working at a prison. And he goes home to his wife and tells her, I don't really like working at the prison, but there's this one person who is very, very peculiar, and I have to think about him a lot of the time. And this person is obviously a serial killer who's like specialized on children, and he always talks, he's frolicking with the children. So it's a very, very disturbing person, and it's a very, very disturbing story. And I literally had nightmares from this story. There is a twist in the story that really, really hits hard. And yeah, this was my introduction to Thomas Ligotti, and I really, really liked this story. I just wanted to say laughed, but that's a very, very inappropriate term for this kind of story. Then there's, I believe, my favorite story in this collection, which is called Masquerade of a Dead Sword. And this is a story which is set somewhere in the medieval times, maybe in the Gothic times. It's not really specified, but it's definitely not our time right now, because we're talking about guys using swords and going to taverns and stuff like that. And I think that's mostly one of the main things I love the story, of course, is the setting, because I very much like medieval settings or Renaissance or Gothic settings, and the characters, or let's say the main character, who's called the Great Feliol. At the beginning of the story, we don't really know why he's called that. Why he's called the Great Feliol. Maybe we learn this throughout the story, maybe we don't. And I really like the character, and the most interesting part for me was the main object of the story. This is not a spoiler, because it's revealed right at the beginning. so we meet this great Feliol, who is a very, very tattered cloak of different colors. But that is not the strangest part about him. The strangest part is that he has very, very weird spectacles or glasses. And this is, those glasses are basically the main object of the story. The whole story revolves around how he got those glasses and what it did to him and what it did to others around him. And yeah, I really, really did like the story. And the next story is, I think, maybe not one of the best, but one of the weirdest stories in this book. I mean, by saying not one of the best, I mean it's still very, very good, and it really subverts everything you know about short stories, I think. It's called Professor Nobody's Little Lectures on Supernatural Horror, and the story starts as you might expect from the title. I thought it was Ligotti telling us how he writes horror. And yeah, but that's not everything in this story, and I don't want to spoil it for you, so I won't talk about it any longer. You really, really have to read this story. And the last story I quickly want to mention in Songs of a Dead Dreamer is The Sect of the Idiot, which is very much a reference to Lovecraft. And I think I read the story and I thought, okay, he's making a bit of fun of Lovecraft, and I don't know if that's true. I probably have to read it again, but I really liked it. And maybe if you know a lot about Lovecraft stories, you maybe know who the Sect of the Idiot is in reference to. And then there's two stories I want to talk about from the second part of the book. And the first one is called The Last Feast of Harlequin, which is dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft, and it's not the most Lovecraftian story in here. I mean, it is very Lovecraftian, but there's another one which is called Vastarian, which is probably the most Lovecraftian story. But The Last Feast of Harlequin is, I think, the longest story in this collection. I think it's about 40 pages long. Yeah, it's 41 pages long. And I mean, the setting is very Lovecraftian. We're following an anthropologist who wants to find out about this feast of Harlequin, which people celebrate in a small town somewhere, probably in the US. And he goes there because his favorite professor wrote about this festival, and he finally found out where it took place. And when he's there, he notices some strange things, and he does a bit of research and detective work, and he finds out some really, really horrifying things. And I really, really did like this story. It has many things I love about this type of horror. It has folk elements, it has Lovecraftian elements, and we're following an academic which is very much in the sense of or in the footsteps of Lovecraft, who also wrote a lot about academics. And yeah, the reveal at the end say, I hope it's not a spoiler, but there's kind of a twist or a reveal in the end, at the end, which I mean, I thought it was really, really well done. It was really, really great. And this is probably a story where his mindset of being an antinatalist shines most. And the last story I want to touch on is called The Library of Byzantium. And this is another story where I really, really do love the setting. We're following a young boy who has to talk to a priest who kind of becomes his mentor and tries to teach him things. And there's a weird book, which could be in reference to the famous Necronomicon. This is maybe a bit of a spoiler, but I really, really want to talk about this. One of my favorite Lovecraft stories is The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. And this is mostly because I really do like the idea of dream worlds. I like the description of dreams in horror or in fiction in general, because you can do things you wouldn't normally do. And let's just say that in the Library of Byzantium, there may or may not be a dream world. And those are basically all the stories I want to talk to you about. You may have noticed that I really, really like the story. I mean, I told you at the beginning that this made me decide I want to start a YouTube channel now. And I think if you are into horror, if you're into weird fiction, you have to read Ligotti. It's sometimes a bit dense, like Lovecraft's works. At least I, as a non-native speaker, had to look up a few words in a dictionary. And my advice for you would be, you have to be in the right mood to read a book like that, because you really have to concentrate on what you read. So I probably wouldn't read this on a train or in your lunch break, but maybe at home, light a candle, drink tea. I don't know what you do when you read in the evening, but yeah, this is probably the setting you have to be in to enjoy those stories. And maybe a bit of a warning, if you haven't read many short stories. A lot of his short stories have either open endings, like they don't really get resolved, or they have what's the opposite of happy ending? Let's say not exactly happy endings. And you have to be prepared for this emotionally as well as intellectually. But overall, I really, really, really enjoyed this short story collection. And I hope you do too. If you've already read this, if you want to read this, please comment down below and tell me about your experiences with weird fiction, with weird horror. I really, really love to hear about it. And with this, see you next week. Goodbye. Have a nice day.